Hi everyone, today I'm bringing you my overview of macros I use to tank as a Blood DK in Cataclysm Classic. This video has been requested by a few viewers over on my Twitch channel, and if you guys have any requests, please tune in to one of my streams or leave a comment below. Before we start, I just want to say I've prepared all the macros that we're going to go through today and more in a detailed breakdown on how they function in a Google Sheet that you can find the link for in the description below. Now, without any further ado, let's get into it. To start with, I want to quickly outline some definitions that I'll be referring to throughout this. I heavily use what are called modifier macros when playing my Blood DKs. A modifier macro simply means when you're holding down a modifier key on your keyboard and then you press another key, your spell cast will change depending on which modifier you are pressing. Next up, we have a cast sequence macro. Cast sequence macros, which cast sequence macros function in an order of a script, and they'll cycle through a spell queue in order with each subsequent key press. Targeting macros are conditions in which we can apply to change the destination of a key press without having to deselect our current target. Now, let's just get into a couple of examples of those. So first up with the modifier macros that, as I mentioned, are pretty much in everything I use. Here, as you can see, is my number one key and on my action bar. It currently shows in the tooltip Outbreak. Now, as with all macros, just to make them super clean so that they always feed through, we always open every line with hashtag show tooltip. That means no matter what it's doing, it's always fetching the data for the current key that it wants to be applying on the next press, whether that's a modifier macro, whether that's a target destination or cast sequence. It doesn't matter, it will always live update so long as you have this line at the beginning. So, as you can see, when I hold down the control key, here, it will change the number one key to cast Icy Touch if I next press it. If I have the shift key down, it will change to Chains of Ice. And if I'm not holding anything, it's going to just display Outbreak. The last line of this macro, the Cancel Aura Hand of Protection, this is a specific line which removes hand of protection that paladins can put on us. It's baked into all my sort of primary macros, specifically for the Helpless Wormbreaker encounter in Bastion of Twilight, as this allows me to call for a hop and not have to try to manually click it off from my buff bar at the top, as it's already automatically removed by me pressing any of my buttons through 1 to 6. Next up is one of my defensive buttons I use. Again, this is a modifier macro. A few of you may be surprised to see in here the Plague Strike. This is just more of a carryover of a habit for me as a player. I've had many, many years where the number one key for Death Knights has been Icy Touch and the number two has been Plague Strike, so it's a very big muscle memory for me. There's still plenty of scenarios that can occur when we're actively tanking in Cataclysm where we still need to reapply our buffs, and Outbreak's on cooldown, and we need to get our debuffs up on the target. And in order to sort of do that, we still have to be able to have the Icy Touch and the Plague Strike key bound, so that's why I still nest them. Next up is my Blood Rune Spender, just a very simple one. It switches between Heart Strike and Pestilence. Now, for the button that we use most of the time when we're playing Death Knight, it is Death Strike. What I can do in here is just to show you if I want to add in for my belt tinker, as it's not updated since I last saved this. Now, if I put this on my action bar, it's going to update, and when I hold down the shift key, it will now use the tinker on the slot 6, which is my belt. So when I press this now with the shift 4, it's going to use my belt and grant me the absorption shield. Unfortunately, it backfired this time, but as you can see, that's how it functions. Next is my first example of a targeting macro, as this is my sort of AoE Blood Rune button. When I'm pressing down the shift key, it will then say wherever the cursor is, I want to cast Death and Decay. So if my cursor is over here, that's where the Death and Decay spell is going to go. I could change this to say at player, and what that would mean is it would always cast directly on top of you. This is pretty good whilst you're drawing an encounter or drawing a pull. That's okay to have that variant, but so long as you somehow in the macro that you're writing still have the ability to cast it on your cursor, as a Death Knight, it's very important to still make use of Death and Decay. as it is effectively like a Paladin's Consecrate that we can cast at range, so we don't want to restrict ourselves to only cast it on the player. Next up, we have the Rune spending and generating macro. As you can see on here, I have still got Death Coil as a Blood DK, which might surprise quite a few of you. When I hold down the control key, it will allow me to cast Death Coil at my targets. The reason for that is there's still plenty of times when all of our runes are on cooldown, our taunts are on cooldown, fights coming to mind such as Alakir, when we're trying to pick up those storm-bound elementals, and it can get very finicky very quickly. You taunt one, range DPS start launching into it, you still need to try and put some aggro, you put an icy touch in it, you put a death coil into it, and now you secured it and it's out of the group and you're tanking and controlling it as intended. The rest of that macros we've already sort of covered with use of control modifiers and shift modifiers. So moving on to the big damage macro. This is sort of the closest thing we'll get to a legendary Swifty one-shot macro. We're basically just sort of popping everything and then pressing Dancing Rune Weapon. So just to go through this quickly, when we hold down the Shift key, this actually uses our first trinket slot. Now for me, I just use this because I actually have the Mirror of Broken Images, as you can see. If I press Shift 6, it pops a big defensive cooldown on me. If you have an aggressive trinket, that will work here too. However, just be mindful. If you have a Tinker on your gloves, that's the slot 10. If you also have a use trinket or an on-use trinket at slot 13 or 14, you won't be able to trigger both until the gloves have expired in their buff, and then you will be able to trigger the trinkets. You can't have both active at the same time. Next up, it consumes a potion, one sacrifice just for the video gods, and then it will move on to use our racial, and then it will trigger the Dancing Rune Weapon. And we've got our stylish Tabard of the Lightbringer there for when we want to be fancy as well. So next up, we can go into some of our utilities, and we're focusing here on the Taunt macro I use. Now, it's a bit more complicated than the other ones we've seen so far, but this is a great example of a modifier and a target changing macro. So this one is asking, do we have the shift modifier applied? If so, then do we check, or then it checks if we have a mouse over target. Is the mouse over target an enemy, and are they dead? If all of that is true, then it will cast Death Grip on the mouse over target if we're holding down the shift key. If we don't have a mouse over target, but we're still holding down the shift key, it will cast Death Grip at the target. If we have a mouse over target, but we're not holding down the shift key, it will cast Dark Command. And if none of those other conditions are met, it will just cast Dark Command on the current target. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but if you want to give a read through, please do check the link in the description to that breakdown that you'll find there. Now, probably the more complicated one is the kick macro I use. Now, this is especially important on fights like Ascendant Council. When you solo tank, this is a blood DK. But let's go through it together here. So we've got a control modifier. If we are a blood elf, we can use Arcane Torrent. My second Death Knight is a blood elf, which is why I use this. Then we have a shift, and we have an at focus. So similar to the at mouse over. If we have a focus target with the exist at the end here, it will say, if we're holding shift and we have a focus target, cast Strangulate at the focus target. If, however, we have a shift being pressed, but we don't have a focus, just press Strangulate at the current target. If we do have a focus, but we're not pressing shift, then cast Mind Freeze at the current target. And if none of those conditions are met, just cast Mind Freeze at the current target. So that's a bit of the more complicated one, but that's how you write it out if you want to do those. Things where this is applied to, as I said, that's in Council, we will set focus on, usually I have it here for, I call them Water Boy and Earth Boy, because we're usually on the Water and Earth bosses for Ascendant Council as a Blood DK. So after this, I've got a couple of the macros here. We've got sort of a pet sacrifice macro. It's just a simple modifier. let's get into the next big one here, which is our Lichborne. So this is our sort of only cast sequence macro that's really relevant at the moment. You can always try and write cast sequence macros, but as a Death Knight with the Rune system, it gets very messy very quickly whenever you get a sort of a dodge block parry or a miss, and it can mess around with your Rune refresh cooldowns as well. So cast sequences are usually bad, and Lichborne is the exception to that rule. So in terms of what this is doing, it says on the first key press, we will cast Lichborne, which turns us undead when we have the talent. Let me just get that up for you now. So when we have the talent Lichborne, we draw upon unholy energy, we become undead for 10 seconds, and that allows us to be the target of death coils that we can cast and other friendlies can cast on us to heal us for an amount. So it casts Lichborne on the first cast, and then the next subsequent, I believe it's 8 death coils here, it will then target at yourself because it's at player. Your death coils, so you can have a fully built up runic mana bar and then you sorry, runic power bar, and then you can launch a load as many death coils as you can into yourself. Now, if you take the 3 out of 3 runic power mastery, it'll actually be the same as if you have 2 out of 3. You'll be able to cast 3 death coils into yourself back to back. But if you can play around this by also having your full rune rotation, you can death strike to get some more healing, get some more runic power, throw a 4th death coil in there, and so long as you press the button within 10 seconds, Lichborne's still going to be active and it's still going to be available, allowing you to cast a death coil on yourself. You can get up to between 5 and 6 casts of this, otherwise you would need to be blowing things like Empowering Weapon, trying to cast an Army of the Dead throughout that duration just to get the runic power back, but by then Lichborne would have failed. A very useful tool. Lichborne itself is primarily a PvP button in Cataclysm, I would definitely say, but not to knock it because it has secured me and my team several kills on progress, where I was able to stay alive in scenarios where either the healers couldn't heal me or the healers had already died in the encounter and we just got that extra healing through to secure the kill. So worth its weight in gold on progress, but as I say, it's now, once you've got all the bosses down and you're on farm, turned into a PvP only talent. So, where were we? I believe next we can quickly go over this, which is our combat res. It is just a very simple one. It's a mouse over, and it checks to see if we can help the target, which means it's a friendly. Is the target dead? And if the target's dead, then we will cast Raise Ally on the mouse over because it's a mouse over target here. And if it's not a mouse over target and we've just got a normal target, it will just cast Raise Ally on it as well. So a good wipe recovery tool, or alternatively a way of saving the dungeon group that's going south very quickly, or just very good to have in combat in general without losing your current target. Now, in terms of a few extra buttons I want to quickly go over with you guys. Every tank should be aware of these 3 buttons. You should have the /ready check if you're in pugs or if you're in dungeon groups. You should also have the /pull 10, which will start a countdown timer for anyone who's using a DBM add-on or equivalent, and the /pull 0. /pull 0 will cancel any active pull timers. So here's an active pull timer, and I then press my cancel pull 0, and there it goes. As you can see, it's gone. So 3 very important macros for any tank to have. So that was just a quick run through of the macros I use playing as a Death Knight in Cataclysm. I have got a couple more here, but if you want to see all of them, please do check the spreadsheet link in the description. And thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers.